Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to Season 2, Episode number 23 of Be With Me, 7 Minutes of Biblical Wonder. You can subscribe at bewithme.us. That's the whole website address. Today we're going to talk about tears in a bottle. I want to tell a story that leads to a verse, which then will lead us back to the story of Lazarus and Jesus weeping that we were looking at in John chapter 11. So I was on a trip to Greece, and I happened to be in Corinth. That is the Corinth of the Bible, an ancient city. It has beautiful ruins with beautiful buildings and temples and a lot of stuff made out of stone that's actually been pretty well preserved. And the people are a little bit harder to touch base with, if you will, from back in history. So there's a museum there, and we were on a museum tour, and in one of the cases were these little teeny glass bottles. And these were about as big as your pinky, the tip of your pinky finger digit. That's how big they were. Maybe some of them, maybe twice that size, 2 digits, something like that. And I said to the tour, the lady that was taking us, what are those? She says, oh, those are very, very precious, and they're little glass bottles. And what made them so precious was, in that period of time, around the time of Christ, is no one in that area could make glass. So even the bottles themselves were precious. So they had to import the glass from far away. I think it was China, I'm not sure. But anyway, they had to come on a boat and then a camel and a donkey over hither and yon, hundreds of, if not thousands of miles, and trade something precious that they didn't have. And so the bottles themselves were very rare and very expensive. And so they had found these bottles inside the grave sites of the people that were buried in the graveyard in Corinth. And so the archaeologists, these forensic archaeologists, had found things in other people's grave sites, jewels and weapons and crowns, but in Corinth it was little glass bottles. And theoretically these glass bottles were empty, but they gave them to their CSI forensic archaeologists, and they studied the residue of what was inside the Bible. And the lady tells me that inside those little teeny glass bottles, buried with various people, were tears, human tears. And it just touched me so much that these people had apparently been mourning over a certain individual. They collected tears either from a single person or maybe from a family or from a group, like, hey, pass the bottle around. Maybe I'm speculating here about how many people were involved with this, but at least one for sure. And their tears were collected and put in a bottle. So I came home and I told someone this story, and they said, oh yeah, that's in the Bible. And I'm like, what? So sure enough, it's in Psalm 56, and let me just start there. This is a story about David, who had been captured, seized by the Philistines, the arch enemy of Israel, when David was in Gath. And this is a psalm that was written while he was in captivity. And here's David. I'll just tell you a few of the lines that are in there. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. This I know, God is for me. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. So those are just a couple lines from the psalm. And then verse 8. So here's David in a foreign captivity, scared, and he says, you have kept count of my tossings. That is at night, like when he can't sleep. Put my tears in your bottle. So David, pursued and seized with fearful and oppressed and pressed in and captured. And we find him here sleepless and crying. And so we find that he is declaring a God who sees, who cares, who hears and accounts. Here it is again. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. you have put my tears in your bottle. And then he finishes, this I know, for God is for me. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. So sure enough, same concept as those people buried in Corinth. We have the Lord God now actually going to be with David in his strife, in his misery, in his captivity, and his tears. And we find the Lord collecting David's tears in his bottle. So same idea here. So let's go to our official passage, which is in John, which is Jesus wept. So we find we have a God who has compassion, who came to conquer and eventually destroy forever, vanquish death and mourning. But in the meantime, he sits Shiva with humanity. I read a story this week about Yoko Ono, and this is near the anniversary of John Lennon's death, and he's outside the Dakota Apartments in New York City, and he gets shot, he gets killed, and his friend in California hears about it, and it's all kind of sketchy because they didn't have the internet then. He calls the doorman, and he'd been a very frequent visitor. The doorman answers the phone, and he says, this is so-and-so. I'm out in California. What has happened there? And the doorman hangs up on him. And he said that's the moment he knew that John Lennon was killed. So he gets on a plane. He flies there. The doorman actually lets him in the night. It's now like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning in New York City. And he goes to the door, and he knocks on the door, and he says, Yoko Ono, he says, I know you're in there. He said, I'm just going to sit out here in the hallway, and when you need me, you can open the door and let me in. And apparently he didn't leave for weeks. So a beautiful story is what do you do in a person's mourning? Well, you sit with them. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus wept. In the meantime, he sits with us in our tears and our pain and our grief. He knows them, he quantifies them, if you will, our sleeplessness at least, and he puts our tears in the bottle. So final thought today is, how would you like to remember Jesus? You know, we've had various mementos of people that have died, a lock of hair or a snippet of their clothing, or maybe a geography trigger like going to their grave site, or going to, let's say, going to Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified, or maybe the burial cloth wouldn't it be great to have a chunk of the cross of the wood that Jesus was crucified on? So I think I probably most want to have a drop of Jesus's blood because it's efficacious and important. But number 2 would be this: I would love to have these tears, the humanity, maybe even his tears, are held and accounted for. Jesus, praise you, and I thank you for being with us and weeping with us.